So last week we started kind of a journey where we're going to be going through three books of the Bible in 12 weeks or so. And we're talking about times of waiting or times of wandering. And sometimes we can look at these times and feel like those times wandering or waiting is just wasted. Like neither we nor God are doing very much. And we can kind of get frustrated that. Yet what we're going to discover in this journey over the next several weeks of the Israelites' journey through the wilderness, we're going to discover that God is constantly working, even in them, through their wandering and waiting, preparing them to walk with him into his promised land. And we began last week with kind of an introduction to it all, and we learned this. Our waiting is never wasted, because God is always working. And so we can be encouraged by that. And these times when we feel like we may be stuck, and you may feel like you're stuck, like I haven't heard from God. I see all these people, they seem to be growing, and I don't seem to be growing much. I'm not getting to where I think God should have me, or these times where we feel stuck in this walk, or waiting for him to work, or to lead us, bring us to our purpose, bring it to light in our lives. These times aren't wasted. Rather, God is working. He's working in us, he's working around us, and he's even working through us in ways we might not see. But what he's doing is he's working in us to prepare us for his plans. So be encouraged in that. And as we begin the book of Leviticus today, so if we're in Leviticus, if you want to turn there, this work in the waiting takes shape as God prepares his people with probably the most important practice that they're going to need during this time in the wilderness that they're going to spend and beyond. In fact, walking with God and facing these trials and keeping faithful, it all springs from getting this thing right. So it all kind of starts here of what we do when we feel like we're waiting. This is the first and foremost what we should be doing. And it's important for them and it's important for us. Now, as we jump into Leviticus, I want to kind of just set the stage of where we are, okay? So it's the second month of the year, in the year around 1446 BC. The children of Israel had just been released from captivity in Egypt, and God delivered them led by Moses. And this nation now, that started with these 12 guys, is now figured in between 2 and 4 million people. So imagine this crowd. And they begin leaving Egypt to go north to the promised land. And it's a journey of nearly 400 miles. And really in that day, it would take a group this size, maybe at most a year or two, to get from Egypt to the promised land. Yet, as we will discover through these three books of the Bible, this journey will take well over 40 years as God prepares and shapes his people. So these 40 years aren't wasted. God is constantly working. Now, where we open the book of Leviticus, we're in the third month of the year, and during these first 2 months, God has led his people out of Egypt. He showed himself faithful. He brought them through the Red Sea, delivering them from the Egyptian army. Then he provided for them sweet water to drink rather than bitter water, and provided for them food in the form of manna. And that manna would continue all these 40 years for them, as God provides for them, which is pretty amazing. And at the beginning of the third month, then they come, or during the second month, they come to the foot of Mount Sinai, which is in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula desert. And they come there where God then gives Moses the 10 Commandments, and they construct the tabernacle. So it's a time where God says, all right, we're taking a pit stop. And while God has been leading his people, and his presence in leading them has been known, it was through this tabernacle that God will draw close to his people. You see, the tabernacle was referred to as God dwelling among his people, or living among his people. And his presence would be that much closer and that much more real and sensed by them. And it's now the fourth month of this journey. And for the next 9 months, God will keep his people here at Mount Sinai. So they'll be stuck, they'll be still. Okay? Now, I don't know about you, but this can be frustrating when you're on a journey. Have you ever been on a road trip? Especially guys. You ever been on a road trip? You're making good time, and then all of a sudden, I gotta go to the bathroom. You got to take a pit stop, right? And you're there at the rest stop, and what do you spend the whole time doing? I spend my whole time looking on the road at all the cars I worked so hard to pass, and now I'm thinking, now I got to pass these people all over again, right? I got to get moving. Well, think of these children of Israel. They've been in slavery, and God says, I have this great promised land for you. This land that's been appointed for you, where I will build you into this nation and bless you, and all these promises given to Abraham. And they're like, great, we want to get there. And they get to Sinai, and God says, you're waiting. So just imagine this, the kind of feeling here. It's kind of like when we feel like we're stuck or we're just in the waiting, right? But this time isn't wasted. In fact, the book of Leviticus chronicles these 9 months. The whole book of Leviticus takes place over these 9 months of their time at Sinai, and how even in the stillness, God is at work. You see, as God draws close to his people, it's time his people learn how to draw close to him. And that's what God's doing here at Sinai. He says, all right, you're getting to know me, but now I want you to draw close to me and be in relationship with me. So he's teaching that. So through the first 9 chapters of Leviticus, which we're going to go through today, and we're going to read. No, we're not going to read them, but we're going to go through them pretty quick because it's a little different because we're taking a higher view at this. So we can get the big chunk and see what God's doing in this. Because sometimes when we're right in close, we don't always see how God is working. And so when we zoom out a little bit, we'll really see what God is really doing. So in the first 9 chapters of Leviticus, God teaches his people, and he teaches us how to draw close to him. It's this worship or drawing close to God that's going to be needed for God's people for the journey that was to come and beyond. And during this time of waiting or stillness, worship needs to be developed so that when they face the storms of life and trials arise, it's going to sustain them and strengthen God's people, helping them and helping us cling to him through these things. So that's what we're talking about. And God teaches this worship through giving them instructions. And here's how he instructs them in worship and drawing close to him: through sacrifices and through a whole bunch of rules for the priests. And you may be sitting there saying, I thought this was what Leviticus is about. A whole bunch of rules that are complicated and hard to understand, and they just kind of get overwhelming, and that's why I don't like Leviticus. This is what God's doing, though. And he works through these 2 ways of instructing his people and giving them. He gives them instructions on sacrifice and the priests who represent the people to God and before God. So I want to grasp what's being taught to the Israelites, because in grasping what's taught to the Israelites, we'll see how it's important for us and what these lessons God is teaching are really critical for us being able to draw close to God. So anyway, he gives 5 sacrifices in Leviticus 1 through 7. And we're going to go through these 5 sacrifices because each of these sacrifices are different. Sometimes we think, well, sacrifice, you just throw a lamb on the fire and poof, you sacrificed. There's all these different sacrifices that God gives. And each of them has a unique spiritual meaning and a purpose. And while also serving as a foundation for worship and relating to God. And so we're going to learn what these offerings or sacrifices are all about. So in chapter 1, we see the first sacrifice, and it is called the burnt offering. The burnt offering. The Hebrew name is the olah. I'm going to give you some Hebrew this morning because I paid a lot of money for seminary and I have to make sure I'm using it somehow. But anyway, the olah it was called. And anyway, what the burnt offering was is that an unblemished animal. Now, it could be a bull, it could be a goat or sheep, it could even be birds. They were brought, and then the people that brought them would slaughter them and present them to the priest. And no matter which animal was brought, what became of them was the same. And here's what it says in verse 9. And the priest shall burn all of it on the altar as a burnt offering, a food offering, which is a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So in the burnt offering, this was burnt to a crisp, burnt basically to ashes. So there was no more. And in this burnt offering, here's the idea of it. What was brought to God or offered to God was wholly burned up or consumed. Can you think of what the picture of this is? See, here's what it is. People would come to God and they would say, have all of me. So this is a way of coming to God, and it's the way we start to come to God, right? In great humility, and we say, God, I am nothing. You are everything, right? We are nothing without God. So we come to him and say, I'm nothing. So I give you it all. Do something, please. And we look at that. So the picture is one of total surrender or devotion or dedication, because the worshiper kept nothing for themselves that they brought. And again, we're nothing apart from God, and we offer our whole self and surrender to God so God can cleanse us, and these people would come to be cleansed and made useful or worthy. And I think this is the kind of sacrifice that Paul was getting at in Romans chapter 12, when he says, I appeal to you, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, that we just give ourselves and we continue to give ourselves, all of it. And it's a continual sacrifice of ourselves, which is our spiritual worship. So that's the burnt offering. Second offering is in the next chapter, and it's called the grain offering, or the mincha. That was pretty good. Anyway, and what would happen in this offering is that they would cook unleavened bread that was seasoned with oils like frankincense and olive oil and other spices, and then it was salted on top. And it was presented to the priests. And then the priest, it says in verse 9 of chapter 2, the priest will take it from the grain offering, its memorial portion, and burn this on the altar, a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So here they took a portion of that bread and they burnt it on the offering. Now when all of those spices would burn, it would make incense almost, and it would smell nice. But really the whole picture of this is a thankfulness for God giving them what they have. It's like saying, all right, God, here's what I'm able to accomplish. I give it to you. I give my work to you. So in a picture, this grain offering is that I can do nothing of significance without you. So I'm coming to you and giving you all my abilities, all that I have, all that I am, and all that I can do. I surrender it to you because I know you can make it meaningful. So that's this sacrifice. Everything we can do, we surrender to God. Then there's a third sacrifice in the next chapter. It's called the peace offering, or the fellowship offering, you may have heard it called. It's the Zavach Shalamim is what it was called. And in this peace offering, the worshipers, they brought an unblemished animal, and it could be various types of animals, but it was treated a little different. The blood is thrown out on the altar sides. It's basically spread all over the altar, the outsides of the altar. And then the fat is removed from the animal, and that is burned up or consumed. But the meat is divided between the priests and the people that brought the meat. So they cooked it on the altar, and then they gave it back to the people so that they could have their friends and family over to share with them. It was fellowship or peace with each other. So it's this idea, it's creating this picture of harmonious relationship with God, with the priests who led them, and with each other is the peace offering. And why did they bring this? Because only God can bring true peace. So they say, we can't do this ourselves. Only God will bring us together. And only God is going to be the focal point that holds us together. Right? He's what unites us. And that's what happens through Jesus, right? Paul talks about that in 2 Corinthians, where he says, all this is from God, who through Christ reconciled or brought us into unity, right? Brought us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation or peace. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting the trespasses against them, and entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. So we come to God to find peace, to experience peace with him, so then we can go out and sow peace with others, true peace. Something our world has no idea what it looks like except if it comes from us, because that comes from God. So that's important, right? So we have the peace offering. Fourth offering, a sin offering. This is the big one. This is probably the one you most think of when you hear about the sacrificial system. In fact, this one goes all the way back to just after the sin in the garden. They had this sin offering, or this burnt offering of an animal, and it was kind of like the burnt offering but different. They were to bring an unblemished animal. They would slaughter it in front of the priest, and then they present it to the priest, and then the priest would take the blood and he would sprinkle it on the four horns that were on each side of the altar. And then he would burn the fat. And then he would take the rest and he would burn that up and then take it outside of the camp, never to be seen again. Starting to see the picture of the sin offering, right? So, so the word, the Hebrew word is katat. And the katat literally means to purify. So this was a purifying offering. So this animal it was a way of confessing sins that I have done, sins of commission, sins of omission, things I haven't done that God wants me to do and I haven't done, things I don't even know that I did. So it covers all of that. And they bring that, and it shows the seriousness that something is messed up with that, and I need to bring this to before God through the priest. And then the blood that gets sprinkled brought forgiveness or cleansing, purification for sin. And we know this because this is what Jesus did, right? This is why Jesus shed his blood. This is why during the Last Supper, he took the cup and he said, "This is my blood," right? A new covenant in my blood. Just doesn't cover sin for a moment. It covers sin for all time, right? Once and for all. And in Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews says, "Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood. And without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sin." So here we're starting to see this blood is very important because it signifies purification or being forgiven or cleansed. And the fat that we keep seeing now that's burned up, that's another symbol of, I guess, our will and our way of indulgence. Our indulging ourselves is the fat. And so it's waste or sin, and that's always consumed, or it's useless, so it's burned up. But the rest of the burnt animal then is set outside the camp. That kind of completes the picture, isn't it? When our sins are forgiven, God says, all right, you don't have to live with it anymore. In fact, if you don't want to sin anymore, don't keep it around. Put it outside the camp. So here's what God's teaching his people. And he gives them the sin offering. And it shows the seriousness of sin as well as the power of forgiveness. And then finally we come to chapters 5 through 7, and it kind of discusses this through chapters 5 and 7, something called the guilt offering. Or God instructs on this guilt offering, this asham. And what it pictures is the costliness of sin, or the shame or guilt that comes along with sin. Because we can be forgiven with sin, but we can still carry it around, can't we? In fact, some of us are very good at that, where even though God forgives us, we can't forgive ourselves, and we carry it around. So God says, I want to instruct you, you don't need to carry this anymore. And he gives them this guilt offering. And this guilt offering was mainly for the purpose of if somebody wronged somebody else and it cost them something, or it resulted in loss or damage. So in this one, how it went was the person who owed this debt because of their wrongdoing would first go to the person and offer repayment. And they would offer repayment plus a fifth, or 20% more than the repayment. So that's showing how much damage we can do with our sin. And he said, so go and make this right with each other. And then come to God. So then they would bring an unblemished ram. And here it's specific, a ram they were to bring. And they would bring it to the priest, who would sprinkle the blood on the horns of the altar. He'd burn up the fat, just like with the sin offering. But then the priest would keep the meat to eat, to provide for their needs. And what that's showing is that sin's costly. And with sin, it always bears a price. Jesus pays the price for forgiveness. He also pays the price for our guilt and our shame. And he wants us to come with him and be freed from that. And that's what he's kind of showing in this, that when we go to this and make it right, then the stain or the guilt of it is gone and we are free. Kind of brings me back to 2 Corinthians, doesn't it? Where Paul says, therefore, if anyone's in Christ, they're a new creation. Right? The old has passed away. Behold, the new is come. We don't have to walk in our past. We don't have to walk in our past failures or our past sins or our past shame anymore. And God gives his people this offering to symbolize that, where they can actually take steps towards it. So all these sacrifices God gives for the people so that they can get along with him, follow the priests, and also get along with each other. But I want you to think about 2 to 4 million people, and it's sacrifice day. And they go to the tabernacle. You know how many altars there are? Imagine the carnage on sacrifice day. Imagine the blood. Imagine the squeals. Imagine the stench and the gore that's happening that day. You see, God's saying, this is messy. And when we disobey or we don't trust God, it's messy. And I can only imagine how messy this looked on those days. And it was a gruesome, smelly mess. And it had to be overwhelming even for the people. But in that, it couldn't be ignored. You see, that's what keeps us from God. That's what keeps us from trusting him for salvation. But it's also what keeps us from drawing close to him, is often these things that we do that are against him or against others that we don't want to deal with or we don't want to face up to. So this drawing with God, closer to God, it's not just about sacrifice. So it's not just about sacrifice because God continues the instructions. It's also about being prepared to draw close to God. So what God does next is he gives instructions are given for the priests and how they should prepare themselves to approach God for the people. If a priest were to serve and lead the people, they need to make sure that they're especially clean and they're holy before God. Or they not only bring judgment upon themselves, but also the people that they serve. So what this meant of preparing yourself, it meant that they needed to do a bunch of ceremonial washing. And in chapter 8 and 9, it talks about all these ways that the priests had to wash themselves. And then the clothes they had to wear, and it got put on in a particular order. And even Moses had to put some of it on, and the headpiece and all of that. And then it says he anoints them then with oil, or sets them apart, anointing them with oil. And then they had to make sure all these sacrifices that they had done all these sacrifices for themselves, so there was nothing outstanding with them. And they had to bring it all before God. Because if they held on to one of those things, then again, they're bringing uncleanness to their ministry and their people. So imagine the importance of this. And he tells them, if you're going to be representing the people to me, then you need to be clean. And it said in chapter 8, as it starts to close, it says, they would do this. Their preparation would be 7 straight days of this, of cleansing themselves, of dressing themselves, of anointing themselves, and of sacrificing, so they could be ready. And it says on the 8th day, here's what it says about that. Moses said, "This thing that the Lord commanded you to do is so that the glory of the Lord may appear to you. You see, you do all of this so you can grasp God's glory, and so when you then go before the people, they're going to see God in you. And they needed to prepare themselves so that they could lead people to see God. You starting to see where this is going here? This picture this is making? Now, all of this was given during this time of rest, this time of not moving, this time where it seems like they started on this journey, they're making good progress, and all of a sudden, we're going nowhere. We're just hanging out here. And as the people were sitting there going, we want to get to the promised land, God says, no, right now, in the stillness, where there's nothing. You don't have to worry about traveling. You don't have to worry about things going wrong. You don't have to worry about enemies attacking you right now. In this stillness, this is what you need to do. You need to learn to draw close to me. You know, it kind of harkens to me in Psalm 46, where it says, be still and know that I am God. Do you know that we have to put ourselves in that waiting or take advantage when God has us in those times? See, sometimes when we're in the waiting, instead of saying, wow, this is a time I can really get to know God and draw close to Him, rather we're like, you know what, God, you need to get on your stuff here. I can't believe you're doing this. What am I doing wrong? Why aren't you doing it? And we start to get upset about it, and we go further away from God. And God says, no, it's during these times I want you to learn to draw close to me, because this is a time where it's still. And there aren't any issues, because there's going to come a day where there are a lot of things going on. And if there's a lot of things going on, you're not going to be able to worship me or come to me. So he's saying, be still and come to me. So you learn to draw close to God through these sacrifices and through the priests. And the worship learned here in this stillness would become a foundation, or we're supposed to become a foundation for the Israelite nation and for all who follow God. This drawing close to God, and in our daily life, and also when we hit trials and troubles that kind of come along our way. So this is what he's kind of telling them. And it's through these instructions for sacrifice and the priests that we learn what it means to draw close to God ourselves. What does it take? What does it look like? What do we need to know to draw close to God, or to grasp to draw close to God? Well, when we better understand these things, we can start to make that connection. I want to help make that connection for you kind of as we wrap up this morning. I want to kind of bring all this together, because I want to show you how we can draw close to God through this instruction. You see, we can draw close to God through this instruction on the sacrifices and the priests, even though we don't have sacrifices today and we don't have priests over the church. We can still draw close to God in what he's talking about here, because through it, we learn about ourselves. You know, through the sacrifices, we learn a lot about ourselves, and through what God set these sacrifices for, we learn a ton about ourselves. They're not just about the blood or the mess or the smell of burning flesh. They actually reveal some important truths about us and our tendencies that help position us to worship God better, to help humble us and have us come to God on His terms. Because that's what worship is, right? Worship is telling God, you are worthy, I am not. We just sang that. And we said, you're worthy of all the glory, so it's not about my glory. Well, how do we do that? We need to know ourselves. When we know ourselves, it helps us worship God better. We can't truly worship God if we glorify or rely on ourselves. The sacrifice presented here teaches some crucial truths. In the burnt offering, it teaches us we're nothing without God. We have no value in and of ourselves. We can try to make ourselves whatever we think. We can have plastic surgery and look the look. We can get all the money we have, and we can say I'm successful. You know the common thing about all those people? They're miserable. They're not happy yet. And they're saying, maybe the one more thing I make about myself, or I make myself into, will make me feel complete. You won't ever feel complete. Because why? We're never complete without Jesus. And the burnt offering teaches us that we're nothing. We need Him to make us complete. The grain offering takes this a step further, teaching that not only are we nothing, but we can do nothing of value How many times do you feel like, oh, if I can just do this, and people look at me and they'll say, man, they really got something going on, you know? I love fishing, man. Somebody goes to me, wow, you're a great fisherman. It makes me feel good, right? But that doesn't make me who I am with God. It's not about what we do that makes us. We have nothing we can do of value if we're doing it in our own strength or for our own reasons. And that grain offering helps us remember that. No, this is all from God. I'm nothing, and I can do nothing apart from him. In fact, in this drawing near to God, we're to surrender all that we are and all we can do to him. And then the burnt offering teaches us that we are nothing without God because of sin. Right? We are unclean. We are unworthy of God because of our sin. And it will always get into place. And this humility is reinforced as we can find no peace with God or others in our own power, the peace offering, right? And we start to realize, wow, I can't do this. I can't make relationships work. You ever try to make relationships work in and of yourself? I make a mess of it. Ask Debbie. She knows. Right? It's only through God making peace there and him being the center. And so we need the peace offering. And then we need this sin offering. Why? Because not only are we not able to have peace with others, we can't have peace with God because of our sin. And we can't overcome our sin, the power and the price of our sin in and of ourselves. We can never be good enough to be good enough. Do you know that? So we need something outside ourselves. We need God to make us clean. Or this sacrifice offered to God to make us clean. And then finally, all of this sin hurts not only ourselves, but it affects and destroys others as well. And that's what will happen to us. We'll leave a swath of destruction if we're living life our own way. And we won't mind because we'll be like, well, at least I'm happy. And we won't see the lives we ruin. Well, all that God says, no. That's the guilt offering. You don't have to live now feeling bad about that or thinking you need to do that to other people. Why? Because I'm freeing you from that. I'm freeing you to walk in me. In short, what this sacrifice teaches us is we are a mess. We are a mess without God. Pretty much says it for good worship, doesn't it? We come to God and say, I'm nothing. God, take me. But you know what? If that were where our focus stayed, it wouldn't lead to worship. You know where it would lead? Despair. Because we'd be sitting there going, I'm nothing. I'm horrible. I'm an awful person. But these sacrifices also teach us about God. Here's what they teach us about God. We learn that we're not the measure of all things, and thus we can't save ourselves. But there is one who can. And does. And makes a way for us. In fact, God's love is demonstrated, and we get to look at it looking back. They're looking at it looking forward at the picture of all these sacrifices, which is Jesus. God in the flesh. Right? All that we are lacking and incapable of doing, he does for us. And I want you to think of these 5 sacrifices because Paul encapsulates them all in the work of Jesus in Colossians 1. Here's what he says. This Jesus, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions, rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. He's before all things, so that all things hold together. Jesus makes us. He gives things value. He gives things worth, not us, because he made them. He knows what's valuable because he's made it that way. And he is the head of the body. The church. He is the beginning, the firstborn of the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. God brings peace, right? And he brings purpose in our lives, in what we do. And he is the one who has purpose, so he is the one who gives purpose. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile or give peace to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his Lamb, erasing guilt offering. You see how all those sacrifices are right there. Paul describes them and he says, but they're all filled. They're all satisfied one place in Jesus. You want to come? You want to draw close to God? We need to know Jesus. If we don't know Jesus, we'll never draw close to God. And then this brings us into the relationship with him. But There's still more that's needed. Sometimes we say, all right, that's what I settle for, a relationship with God. And now I'm good, and I feel like I'm worth it, and I feel like Jesus is all these things, I'm good. And then we get frustrated again. We say, why am I getting frustrated in life? Why am I getting mad at God? Why do I feel like I'm stuck? Do you know why? Because we're not growing in a relationship with God. We're not walking with Him. And this is where His instruction to the priests comes in. Because to continue great worship, or doing these things that the priest does, or to be like them, we need to prepare ourselves like He gives instructions for them. And we prepare them, and what we do is we learn about what it means to be His, or what it means to walk with Him. Because this is the instructions for the priests. This is what it should be in our own lives. Our own lives, we should be filled and consumed with Jesus and being ready for Him and being holy and acceptable, which means we're cleansing ourselves. We're growing in Him, right? And we're presentable to Him, not in a fake way, but in a real way. So what that means then is, like the priests, when we blow it, we go to Him and we say, hey, forgive me. Please change me, God. And we're relying on Him for forgiveness and for change. And that's the whole thing of what the priests are doing. It's nothing about themselves. It's all what they're being clothed with. And they're being clothed with the glory of God. So that when they walk in that and they're prepared, people don't see them, they see the glory of God in and through them. Isn't that a beautiful picture? That's what we present. And so Jesus fully prepared, and He's holy. Because as we had the priest was a temporary office. Because you know what happens? When Jesus came, He became the priest. In fact, Hebrews says, He is now the high priest who is seated on the right hand of the throne. Now, it's interesting because the priests always stood to do all their work because they had so much to do. Here, Jesus is like, I'm done. I'm now this mediator. Everybody who comes to the Father comes through me. Isn't that what He said to His disciples? Right? I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me, the mediator, the priest. And so Jesus is this high priest. But do you want to know something really cool? I want you to look at 1 Peter and what he says about us. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a people for His own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. We don't need a priest because we have Jesus, and then we can come to Him through Jesus. And we can come to Him and worship Him and hear from Him and have personal fellowship with Him like the priest did back here in Leviticus. And we get to walk with Him. And not only do we get to walk with Him, but then we get to go before God for others. We get to pray for others. And we get to say, God, they need to know You. Draw them close to You through me. Isn't that what Peter is saying here? That we may proclaim the excellence of Him who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. What did Jesus say on the Sermon on the Mount? You're the light of the world. People look at you and they see me. So what He's saying is, as this priest, when we prepare ourselves, we're preparing ourselves not only for fellowship with Him, but also so that others can see Him in us or through us. And that's the beautiful thing of drawing closer to Him, because the more we draw close to Him, the more others will be drawn closer to Him through us. When we prepare ourselves and when we draw close to Him. So that's what it's all about. And all of this, again, God didn't teach it to His people in the middle of the storm, did He? He didn't do it in a crisis. He didn't do it in the Red Sea as the Egyptian armies are crushing in on them. They're almost there, and He says, let me tell you a little bit about drawing close to me. And you need to worship me. And you need to stay. And they're just like, no, we need to go. Why? Because that's how we are oftentimes in trouble, right? When trouble hits or when crisis hits our life, we want to just act. And usually it's acting in our own way. So God says, no, you need to learn this in the stillness. You need to learn this when you take yourself aside. You pit stop yourself and you say, all right, God, in the stillness, I want to know you. And that's what he's doing here in Leviticus 1-9. And he stills them. He makes them wait so that they learn who they are, they learn who he is, and who they are in him, so that they can draw close to God in worship. Because from this place of worship will come everything else they experience. And if they're not worshiping God, then it's not going to go well for them. And we're going to see instances of that. But when they're worshiping him well, oh boy, how things go. And it's really cool, some of the things we're going to see. So when the storms and chaos and activity comes, they're going to need this. And we're going to need it in our life. You see, I want to give you this challenge this morning as we close. We need to take advantage of times of calm. We need to make times of calm when we can learn to worship better or learn to draw close to him. If we don't draw close to God in the stillness, why should we think we'll do it when the storms come? That's our challenge. That's our challenge to think about here and with the Israelites. Hey, if we're not doing it now, what makes you think when we're not thinking straight and there's all these things crushing on us, we're all of a sudden going to summon it up and go, oh, now I get it. We do it here and we prepare ourselves. You see, that's why God makes us wait. That's why God, sometimes we wander, because God says, I'm shaping you. Even through sometimes of our disobedience and punishment, he shapes us so that we can grow in him and be better prepared to follow him. So this is where it all begins, with drawing close to God. Let's pray.